The doorbell rang on an ordinary Friday morning. I wasn't going to answer. It was usually someone selling solar panels or internet packages. But it rang again, firmer this time. I stepped out, crumbs from my toast still on my fingers. A young woman stood there. Her black hair was neatly tied back, a backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes both determined and uncertain. "Are you Marta Rivera?" I nodded slowly. "My name is Camila," she said. "I'm Luis's daughter." I froze. It had been 20 years since anyone had spoken that name. No one dared to. "He's gone," she continued. "Before he passed, he told me to give you this. A minor silver key. Nothing special. But I knew it would unlock the door to a truth I'd buried all my life. I am Marta. I'm 68 years old. And this is the story I once thought I'd take to my grave. If you believe the best chapters in life can begin at any moment, stay with me. And don't forget to subscribe to true stories of family, faith, and forgiveness. 20 years have passed, and I can still remember the smell of Julio's enchiladas every Monday morning. The spicy red sauce filled the tiny kitchen behind the restaurant we built together over nearly 2 decades. La Vida de Julio. That was its name. It wasn't just our livelihood. It was our life, love, faith, and sacrifice. Julio was my husband, a quiet man with a kind smile and warm eyes. He cooked. I kept the books. Luis, our only son, was his father's shadow. He learned to season food before he could read. By 22, he worked full-time at the restaurant, diligent, punctual, never complaining. I used to think we were the kind of family people wrote glowing articles about. We weren't rich, but we were content. Julio didn't trust banks. Years of living in Veracruz, where his family lost everything during a financial collapse, had made him wary. He never put money anywhere except the safe. "This," he'd say, placing a hand on the cold metal door, "is something I can touch. This is something I can keep." He'd tuck a small portion of the earnings every week after closing, organized, labeled. Buyout fund, emergency fund, payroll, taxes, and the biggest envelope of all, future fund. We'd been renting the space since our first year in business. The landlord had once promised to sell it to us when we could afford it. After 14 years, we were close to $300,000. We'd built a dream with our hands, sweat, oil burns, and 1,000 nights of counting receipts until our eyes blurred. Julio taught Luis how to open the safe on his 21st birthday. I remember it clearly. He called him into the office, wrote the code on a sticky note, and burned it once Luis memorized it. "If anything ever happens to me, you'll need to take care of your mother," he said. Luis nodded, eyes solemn, as if he'd just received a will. I wasn't worried. Luis was the kind of son every parent dreams of. He didn't smoke, party, or hang out with strangers. While others his age were in bars or on vacations, he worked extra shifts. I trusted him more than I trusted myself. Once I misplaced an envelope meant for a supplier. Luis found it in a drawer and handed it back without reproach. "You've got too much on your plate, Mom," he said. "Next time, let me double-check with you." Julio and I would sit at dinner, watching him wipe down tables and smile at each other in quiet gratitude. No words were needed. We knew how lucky we were. That's why when Camila said, "I'm Luis's daughter," what I felt first wasn't surprise. It was fear. Because if Camila was honest, then the past I'd spent 20 years burying was clawing its way back to the surface. And that could only mean one thing. The son I had trusted and loved above all else had lived a life I never knew existed. That morning began like any other. Julio left early to check the deliveries. I stayed in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for the Tuesday lentil soup special. The radio played an old bolero that Julio loved, and the smell of sautéed garlic filled the air. I remember the morning light streaming through the kitchen window, glinting off the stainless steel stove. Everything seemed perfectly calm. Then I heard a sound. Not a pan dropping, something heavier, duller, stranger, like a large body collapsing onto the floor. I ran to the back, heart pounding, and I saw him. Julio was lying on the office floor. His face was pale and ashen, his hands twitched, his eye was half open, and his lips were moving as if trying to form words. His right hand still touched the safe. Its door swung wide open. Inside was nothing. I screamed his name over and over. My hands shook so badly I couldn't dial 911 correctly the first time. I held him close, feeling his body grow colder with every second. 3 days later, Julio was gone. He never woke up. Machines kept him breathing, but the doctors shook their heads. They said massive heart attack, irreversible damage, critical condition. But I knew. The shock of seeing that empty safe killed him. And Luis disappeared. I called him at least 50 times. The phone rang, then went to voicemail. I went to his apartment on the second day after Julio was admitted. I knocked. No answer. I begged the doorman and explained everything. He hesitated, then opened it with a spare key. Everything was in place, a shirt hanging on a chair, plates are still in the sink, a half-read book on the table. But Luis was gone, and his car wasn't in the lot. He had left. No note, no letter, no trace. On the third day, Julio died. I signed the death certificate with a hand that no longer felt like my own. The police came, asking the usual questions. Who knew the safe code? Any strangers around recently? They didn't accuse me, but their eyes said enough. Only 3 people knew that combination: Julio, me, and Luis. The funeral was quiet. Neighbors, a few loyal customers. Everyone offered sympathy, but behind me, I heard the whispers. They say her son took all the money and ran. Poor Julio, trusted his boy and it killed him. I couldn't stay at the restaurant. I couldn't look at that stove or hear the safe click open without seeing Julio on the floor again. I sold it for cheap and I almost gave it away. The new owner changed the name within a month. I moved into a smaller apartment, started working mornings at a hotel, afternoons at a supermarket, and evenings doing bookkeeping for small shop owners. Money stopped being a dream. It became survival. Every dollar had to be counted. I once had a family, a life, a son I loved more than anything. And in a single moment, it all vanished. In the early years, I couldn't say his name. I avoided old photos, avoided the dishes he loved, and avoided the streets we'd walked together. The kitchen in my small apartment no longer smelled of stew or cornbread, only of stale coffee and exhaustion. I worked 3 jobs a day, up at 5 to clean rooms at a hotel, afternoons scanning hundreds of items at the supermarket, evenings hunched over receipts for shop owners who paid me by the hour. Day after day, week after week, I didn't have time to fall apart. But anger doesn't need time. It just stays, silent, steady. I was angry at Luis for taking everything, not just the money, my husband, my faith, the future Julio and I had built with 14 years of sweat, angry that he never came back. No explanation, no call, no letter, not even a few words. Angry at myself for trusting him too much, for missing the signs, for believing my son could do no wrong. The city changed too. Every street held a memory, a trip to buy supplies, a winter night sharing cornbread by the counter. Each memory is a small blade, slicing tiny pieces off my mind. I lived like a shadow, earning just enough to cover rent, eating instant noodles, and hand-washing clothes because the laundromat was too expensive. I cut ties with the past. No birthdays, no Thanksgiving, no Christmas, just gray days, one after another, colorless, tasteless. Whenever someone said child, it felt like cold water poured down my back. Once at the supermarket, an older woman asked how many children I had. I smiled, paid, and walked away. People call it silent pain, but for me, it was loud, restless inside, never letting me sleep. Sometimes I dreamt of Julio. He was always in the kitchen, back turned, seasoning his stew like he used to. I'd run toward him, wanting to hold him, but I never reached him, no matter how far I ran. I'd wake up with my hand on my chest. the pain no longer sharp like the first years, but dull, constant, like an old ache that never leaves. People say, forgiveness sets you free. But how do you forgive someone who killed your husband, who turned you into a stranger in your own life? I didn't need forgiveness. I needed survival. And I did survive. Alone, but unbroken. I thought I'd take that anger to my grave. No one would speak Luis's name again. No one would ask about him. No one would knock on my door. Until that morning. Until Camila stood before me, holding a silver key. That afternoon, San Diego was wrapped in a thin veil of fog. I don't remember exactly how I decided to go with Camila. It felt like someone else was guiding me by the hand, not me, the woman who once swore she'd never forgive. Camila gave directions. She spoke little, her voice soft, as if afraid to wake the pain I wasn't ready to remember. We drove past old warehouses and faded walls along Marina Boulevard until we stopped in front of a storage lot lined with hundreds of orange metal doors. "Here it is," she said, "Unit 113. I held the key in my hand, small, cold, nothing special, yet my fingers trembled. Camila stood beside me in silence. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. Click. The door rattled open with a creaking sound, like a whisper from the past. Dust floated in the dim light. I held my breath. A dark blue safe stood in the center of the small 10-square-meter room, precisely like the one from our restaurant. I froze. "It's the same kind?" Camila asked quietly. I nodded. "Exactly the same." On top of it, a small note, 6 handwritten numbers, slightly slanted, Wenskin 0579, Luis's birthday. I placed my hand on the dial, 16 right, 05 left, 79 right. My palms were sweating, but I didn't stop. The safe opened. Inside, money, piles of it. Neatly bundled, labeled by denomination. Each stack is marked with a year, 2004, 2006, 2009, 2013, up to the last year. I stepped back, leaning against the wall, my heart pounding. "Help me," I said, voice shaking. Camila took out her phone and opened the calculator. I counted each bundle, each bill. She totaled it. $382,000, she said, far more than the amount we'd once saved. I sank to the floor among the stacks of cash. My emotions swelled, uncontrollable. I didn't know if I was angry or relieved. I just knew I was crying. Inside the safe were 3 cardboard boxes, each labeled in handwriting, Camila. We pulled out the first one. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, organized by year. Camila as a newborn. Camila is taking her first steps. Camila at her kindergarten graduation. Camila with a pink birthday cake. Camila at her quinceañera. My throat tightened as I saw Luis in some of them. Standing behind her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. His eyes were filled with something not quite joy, but a deep, aching sorrow. The second box held papers, bank statements, wire receipts, hospital bills, car repair invoices, and the same mysterious documents I had received from unknown sources years ago. The rent payments I'd thought came from an assistance program, the hospital bills someone had quietly paid, the envelopes that appeared in my mailbox were without return addresses. All of them had come from Luis. The last box held a small wooden case. Inside, an old, silver watch, no longer ticking. I turned it over. Engraved on the back were the words, "To Luis, class of 1997. Love, Dad." I broke down. Julio had spent a whole month's wages to buy that watch. Luis had kept it for over 2 decades, even though he never returned. Finally, I noticed a thick envelope with my name on it. Marta. The handwriting was unmistakable. My hands shook. "He wrote that letter a week before he passed," Camila whispered. "He told me to deliver it to you personally." I held the letter. It felt heavy, not just with paper, but with 20 years of waiting, grief, and a too-late confession. I sat in the kitchen, the yellow light falling over the worn paper. On the envelope, the handwriting was still clear. Marta. My hand trembled slightly as I opened it. The paper inside had turned yellow with age. The slanted handwriting was so familiar, it hurt. I took a deep breath and began to read. Mom, if you're reading this, it means I never got to speak to you again. I paused. My chest tightened. How many years had it been since my son last called me Mom? I know what you think of me, that I'm a thief, that I betrayed the family's trust. You have every right to think that. But please, just this once, listen to me. I gripped the letter tighter. I didn't know whether I wanted to keep reading or throw it into the fire. That year, I was 22. Carlos, an old classmate, said there was a side job, delivering a package from San Diego to Tijuana. One night, $2,000. I was young, foolish, and ambitious. I wanted to buy a car, be independent, and stop asking you and Dad for help. I didn't ask questions. I didn't know what was in the trunk. Carlos finally told me, but not until the window shattered in the middle of the night. Heroin. 5 kilos. Worth over $300,000. I dropped the letter. My eyes widened. It hadn't been simple theft. It had been life and death. 2 hours later, 3 men showed up. They knew your name, the restaurant. What color apron did Dad wear when he cooked? They threatened me. 48 hours. Get the money or your whole family disappears. They forbade me from calling the police. They said if I betrayed them, you would die first. I gripped the edge of my chair, cold sweat trickling down my neck. For years, I thought my son was a thief. He had been a terrified boy. I remembered the safe code, every envelope Dad kept. My hands shook as I opened it. I knew what I was doing, but I thought, at least I was protecting you. I planned to call to explain, but when I heard Dad had a heart attack, I lost all courage. I knew I had killed him, not with a weapon, but with silence. I closed my eyes. Tears welled up. Julio. He never knew the truth. I've lived in Tijuana ever since. Worked in construction, lived frugally, saved every dollar year after year. Each time I had had enough, I put it in the safe, marked the year, the purpose. Those envelopes that arrived without names, they were from me. The hospital bills that were suddenly paid, me. I never dared sign my name, only watch from afar. I looked at the box of papers. Every statement, every bill, a shard of the past, proof that my son had always been there, unseen. Mom, I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But if you can, please make room in your heart for Camilla. She bears no fault. She's the best part of what's left of me. The money in the safe, all of it, is yours. I kept nothing. Only one truth. I've always loved you. Wherever I am, I'm still your son. Luis, I folded the letter. My hands no longer trembled, but my heart did. For 20 years, I had carried a rage that felt eternal, and in 15 minutes, it turned into an ache beyond words. Luis had been wrong, deeply wrong, but he'd spent his life paying for it, and now I was the only one who could decide where that pain would end. A week after reading the letter, I agreed to go with Camilla to Monterey. I had once sworn I would never leave San Diego again. I'd grown used to my small apartment, my worn-out kitchen, the hum of traffic outside my window. But this time, I carried something I hadn't held in 20 years, a question unanswered. We crossed the border by land. Camilla drove. I sat beside her, clutching a small bag that held the letter, Julio's silver watch, and a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. She didn't speak much. We listened to local radio. The old Spanish ballads made me remember my youth. The cemetery was on the outskirts of the city, not large, not grand. The ground was uneven, the wind dry, and the headstones scattered without order, but the place was clean and cared for. Camilla pointed. Over there. I slowed down, my legs heavy, as if they wanted to stop at every step. And then I saw it. A simple stone. Luis Rivera, 1979 to 2022. A devoted father, a son who carried his guilt. My heart clenched. Nothing can prepare you for the moment you stand before your child's grave, the child you once birthed, carried and taught to speak, the one you stayed up nights waiting for, the one you hated, cursed, for 20 long years. Camilla stepped back, giving me space. I knelt and placed the flowers before the stone. The wind brushed through my hair. I laid my hand on the cold stone. "You spent your life atoning," I whispered, "and I spent mine being angry." I took out the watch and placed it beside the flowers. "Your father would forgive you." "I think so." I looked up at the sky. No tears came. I thought I'd cry, but I didn't. What I felt went beyond tears. It was as if I was laying down a piece of my soul for him to carry away. "You didn't make the right choice," I continued softly, "but you didn't make the wrong one either. You saved me. You watched over me. You paid the price, and that has to mean something." I drew a deep breath. Forgiveness isn't easy. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive, but I understand now, and I accept. I stood up and turned toward Camilla. She was wiping her tears. I smiled and took her hand. "Let's go home." On the way back, I looked out the car window. The Mexican countryside passed by like a slow-motion film. In my mind, I no longer saw Luis beside an empty safe, but a 10-year-old boy in a chef's hat, standing beside Julio in the restaurant kitchen, laughing freely. Maybe I no longer had a son, but I had Camila, and she was the part of him I was ready to keep. I don't know when Camila started calling me Grandma. Maybe it was the morning after our trip to Monterey, when she poured me a cup of coffee and set it on the table with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Grandma," she said softly. I didn't correct her. I just nodded. From then on, she came by more often. Sometimes I would sit quietly in the kitchen with vegetables from the market, doing homework while I worked on my clients' ledgers. Not loud, not rushed, but present. One afternoon, I opened the storage safe again. I counted every dollar. I didn't keep it locked away anymore. I deposited it in a bank for the first time in over 40 years. I opened a new joint account under my name and Camilla's. I used part of it to fix the apartment, replace the leaky faucet that had dripped for 3 years, repair the old cabinet doors, and buy a new stove. I quit my hotel job and cut back on bookkeeping clients. For the first time in my life, I could sleep until 7. I started buying better coffee, not the cheapest kind. I planted small pots on the balcony, plants I'd once dismissed as unnecessary. Then one day, Camilla asked, "Grandma, can you teach me to make tamales like Grandpa Julio used to?" I froze. It had been so long since anyone mentioned that dish. We started from scratch, mixing the dough, marinating the meat, wrapping each corn husk carefully. I showed her how to fold the edges so the filling wouldn't spill. She learned fast. Every motion reminded me of Julio, his patient stance, the ladle in his hand, the quiet focus in his eyes. We ate tamales that Saturday night, a small table, just the two of us, and Julio's silver watch beside the plate no longer ticked, but it still meant everything. I hung a few photos in the living room, Julio in the kitchen, Luis smiling in front of the restaurant, and Camilla at her graduation. 3 generations, 3 faces. One imperfect story, but a family story nonetheless. One weekend afternoon, Camilla and I went to the plant nursery together. I chose white chrysanthemums, the flowers I'd laid on Luis's grave. She chose cilantro, mint, and cherry tomatoes. "For the balcony," she said, "to make the tamales taste better." We prepared the soil, planted the seeds, and watered them. Our hands were muddy, but our hearts were light. I realized some things can never be fixed. Julio won't come back. The years I lost won't return. But even from ruin, from barren ground, something new can grow. Maybe that's all that truly matters. Not letting pain stop with you, letting it become something else, something better. And I chose to turn mine into a garden. Camila looked up, hands still covered in dirt. "Grandma," I turned to her, "if Luis were alive, do you think he'd be happy to see this?" I looked at our small garden, the tender sprouts, the afternoon sun warming each leaf. I nodded. Yes, he'd be very proud.